In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, some legends are born in blood, while others are buried in lies. This isn't a story about cowboys and simple gunfights. It's the story of a woman with a haunted past, a town built on secrets, and a dying man on a rope whose silence held the fate of a nation. They called him a savage, a murderer, and they built a gallows just for him. But when Elara Vance risked everything to cut him down in the dead of night, she wasn't just saving a man from death. She was unleashing a ghost from a forgotten war, and uncovering a truth so powerful it would set the entire frontier ablaze. Stay with me as we unravel the true story of the woman who rescued a dying warrior, only to learn he was the legendary Apache Heir. The heat in Redemption's Bluff was a physical entity. It pressed down from a bleached white sky, radiated up from the baked clay of the street, and seemed to emanate from the very souls of the townsfolk. It was a dry, suffocating heat that promised no relief, only judgment. And in the center of town, casting a long skeletal finger of a shadow, stood the instrument of that judgment, a freshly built gallows. Elara Vance felt the heat more than most. For her, it was tangled with the memory of another fire, another sun-baked afternoon that had stolen everything. She ran her small infirmary out of a modest adobe building at the edge of town, a place where she stitched up knife wounds, set broken bones and dispensed laudanum and quiet sympathy in equal measure. She was the daughter of a disgraced Boston physician, carrying his knowledge like a penance, and she had come west not for opportunity, but for anonymity. But there was no anonymity in Redemption's Bluff that week. The town was swollen with a fever that had nothing to do with sickness. It was the fever of righteous fury stoked by one man, Marshal Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself. Tall, lean, with eyes the color of a washed-out sky, he ruled the town, not with a badge, but with a presence that coiled and struck like a sidewinder. He had captured his prize, an Apache warrior found near dead by a dry riverbed, accused of raiding the Miller homestead. The evidence was flimsy, a single stolen horse found wandering miles away, but in 1888, Arizona, an Apache's presence was evidence enough. They didn't know his name. They simply called him Shadow for his unnerving silence and the dark intensity of his gaze. Elara had seen him only once, when Thorne paraded him down the main street, bound in chains. He was younger than she expected his face, a mask of defiant angles and bruised pride. His body was a road map of scars, but it was his eyes that had arrested her. They were not the eyes of a savage killer. They were ancient weary and held a profound sorrow that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest. Now he was slated to hang at dawn. The night before the execution, Elara couldn't find peace. The celebratory whoops from the saloon grated on her nerves. She stood at her window looking out at the gallows, a stark silhouette against the star-dusted canvas of the desert sky. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick with the scent of ozone and distant rain. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a clinical detached mantra from her youth, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. To let a man hang on circumstantial evidence, a man whose guilt she profoundly doubted, felt like the greatest harm of all. A sudden, desperate idea took root in her mind. It was madness. It was suicide. Thorne would hunt her to the ends of the earth. But the image of the warrior's eyes, filled with a silent story she couldn't bear to see extinguished, overrode all reason. She began to move, with a quiet, frantic purpose. She packed a medical satchel, carbolic acid sutures, bandages, morphine. She pulled on a sturdy riding skirt and her father's old duster. Then she took a small, heavy box from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, nestled on velvet, were 2 surgical-grade scalpels, impossibly sharp, and a vial of concentrated chloral hydrate. Her plan was flimsy, reliant on the storm, the town's drunken stupor, and a sliver of luck she wasn't sure she possessed. The gallows was guarded, but Thorne's deputies were likely more interested in whiskey than vigilance. As the first clap of thunder rumbled, shaking the very glass in her window, Elara Vance slipped out into the darkness. She wasn't an avenging angel or a righteous crusader. She was just a woman who had seen enough death and was willing to gamble her own life to prevent one more. She moved through the alleyways, a phantom in the rising wind, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the cold steel of the scalpel, a chilling promise in her pocket. The shadow on the gallows was waiting. The storm broke with biblical fury. Wind howled through the narrow streets of Redemption's Bluff, kicking up clouds of stinging dust and tearing at loose shutters. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that turned the world into a churning monochrome chaos. It was the perfect cover. Elara crept towards the gallows, her body pressed against the rough wall of the general store. The two deputies, raw-boned youths named Cletus and Jeb, were huddled under the minimal shelter of the platform's overhang, a half-empty bottle of rye passing between them. They were complaining about the weather, about the marshal, about the thankless job of watching a half-dead man die. Her plan hinged on their complacency. She circled around to the back of the undertaker's office, her boots sinking into the mud. She found what she was looking for, a discarded canvas tarp, heavy and smelling of dust and formaldehyde. Dragging it behind her, she approached the gallows from the rear. The thunder was a constant rolling barrage, now masking any sound she made. With a deep breath, she acted. She poured a generous amount of the chloral hydrate onto a thick rag. It was a potent sedative. Her father had used it for hysterical patients. Too much could be fatal, but she gambled on the deputies' constitutions being fortified by cheap whiskey. In a single fluid motion, she rose up behind them. Before they could react, she pressed the soaked rag over Cletus's face, while simultaneously bringing a heavy rock she'd palmed down on the back of Jeb's head. Jeb crumpled instantly. Cletus struggled for a moment, his muffled shouts lost in a crack of thunder, before his eyes rolled back and he slumped to the ground, her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. There was no going back. She scrambled up the 13 steps of the gallows. The Apache warrior was there, chained to a post, his head bowed against his chest. The rain plastered his black hair to his face and neck. He was conscious, but barely. When she approached, he lifted his head, and in the flash of lightning, she saw his eyes again. There was no fear, only a flicker of exhausted surprise. "I am not here to hurt you," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. "I'm getting you out." He said nothing, merely watching her with that unnerving stillness. His wrists were shackled, the chains bolted to the thick timber post. Her hands, surprisingly steady, went to work. She didn't have the keys, but she had her father's tools. She used the thin, sharp point of a scalpel, jamming it into the crude lock mechanism. She twisted, scraped, and prayed. The cheap metal groaned in protest. For an agonizing minute, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp click, the first lock sprang open. His eyes widened slightly. The second was more stubborn, but the storm was her ally. Another flash of lightning illuminated the lock's inner workings, and she saw the tumbler she needed to trip. It clicked open. He was free from the post, but the heavy iron cuffs and leg irons remained. He staggered, his body weakened by injury and starvation. He was taller than she'd realized, and leaned heavily against her. "Can you walk?" she asked urgently. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Getting him down the slick steps was a treacherous ordeal. He moved with a pained, shuffling gait, but also with a strange, innate grace, as if his body remembered a strength his muscles had forgotten. She draped the undertaker's tarp over him, a crude disguise that made him look like a heap of abandoned supplies. Her infirmary was her only sanctuary. She guided him through the muddy labyrinth of back alleys, her arm around his waist, supporting his weight. Every shadow seemed to hold the spectre of Marshall Thorne. The journey of 200 yards felt like a mile. They finally stumbled through her back door, collapsing into the small dark room just as a tremendous fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a stark blue-white flash. She barred the door and dragged him towards the hidden entrance to her root cellar. It was small, cool, and smelled of damp earth and medicinal herbs. It would have to be their world for now. She lit a single lantern, the flickering golden light playing over his battered form. Now the true work began. She cut away the remnants of his shirt. His torso was a canvas of torment. A festering bullet wound high on his left shoulder, the flesh around it angry and red. His ribs were a landscape of deep purple and black bruises, suggesting a savage kicking. Lacerations crisscrossed his back. "This will hurt," she said, her voice softening to the professional calm she adopted with patience. He laid on the pallet. She prepared his jaw tight, his eyes following her every move as she cleaned the wound with carbolic solution. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but she saw the muscles in his neck corded tight, the sweat beading on his brow. The bullet was lodged deep against the clavicle. "I have to get it out," she murmured more to herself than to him. She administered a small dose of morphine, enough to dull the edge of the pain, but not enough to render him unconscious. She needed him awake. She took the scalpel. The same tool that had picked the locks now became an instrument of healing. As the storm raged above them, a furious cleansing tantrum, Ilara Vance bent over the silent Apache warrior, delving into his torn flesh to save a life she had just stolen from the gallows. And in the dim subterranean light, she noticed something she'd missed before. Around his neck, on a thin leather cord tucked beneath his collarbone, was a small, intricately carved piece of turquoise. It was shaped like a hawk in flight, its craftsmanship, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was not the trinket of a common raider. It was a mark of significance, a whisper of the secret he held in his silence. Dawn broke pale and bruised over a town washed clean by the storm. But the mood was anything but clean. An unholy rage descended upon Redemption's Bluff when the two deputies were found unconscious and the gallows stood empty. Marshal Elias Thorne, deprived of his public spectacle, became a man possessed. He tore through the town like a hawk, scattering chickens, his fury a palpable force. Doors were kicked in, stables searched, and every resident was subjected to his cold, accusing stare. Down in the cool, earthy dark of the root cellar, Ilara and her patient existed in a separate reality. The warrior, her prisoner, her patient, her terrible secret drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke words she didn't understand, a language of soft consonants and guttural clicks that sounded like the earth itself speaking. She kept him hydrated with willow bark tea, changed his bandages, and listened to the muffled sounds of Thorne's rampage from the street above. On the third day, the fever broke. She was changing the dressing on his shoulder when his eyes opened and focused on her with startling clarity. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own breathing. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a dry rasp, but the single English word was clear and unaccented. Ilara was taken aback. She had assumed he spoke no English. "They were going to kill you," she said simply, her hands not ceasing their work. The evidence was a lie. He watched her, his gaze analytical searching. "You risk the rope for an Apache." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact weighted with disbelief. "I'm a healer," she replied, meeting his gaze. My father taught me that a life is a life. The rest is just noise. He considered this a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He was testing her, she realized. He wanted to know the shape of her soul. The townsfolk call me Shadow. The soldiers called me Geronimo's ghost. What do you call me? Ilara finished tying the bandage and wiped her hands on a cloth. I call you the man who is healing in my cellar. I don't have a name for you. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. My name is Keitan. The name felt important, solid. It replaced the faceless spectre of Shadow with a man. For days they existed in this suspended reality. He healed with a speed that astonished her. His body, honed by a life she could barely imagine, seemed to knit itself back together. He began to move around the small space, his grace returning his silence, no longer just a symptom of injury, but a part of his nature. They spoke in hushed tones. He asked about her father's books, her strange medicines. She learned that he had been taught English as a child in a brief, failed attempt at a reservation school. He spoke it carefully, deliberately, as if translating thoughts from a deeper, more natural tongue. She in turn found herself telling him things she had told no one. She spoke of her father, Dr. Alistair Vance, a brilliant man ruined by an addiction to the very laudanum he prescribed. She told him of the fire, not a raid, as the townsfolk assumed, but a terrible accident caused by a drunken gambler in a saloon next to their home in a dusty Texas town. She was the only survivor left with a deep-seated hatred, not for any race of people, but for the casual, careless violence of the world. Keitan listened without judgment, his stillness a comforting presence. He told her little of himself, speaking only in frustratingly vague terms about his people, the Chiricahua, and the long, broken trail they walked. The pressure from above was mounting. Thorn, unable to find his quarry, began to tighten the screws on the town. He offered a staggering reward, $500 in gold for any information leading to the Apache's capture. Greed became his new deputy, turning neighbors into spies. Ilara saw the way people watched her now when she went out for supplies. Her purchases of extra food and bandages, though small, were noted. The blacksmith, Jedediah Smith, a man she'd always considered a friend, gave her a long, strange look when she bought a length of chain, claiming it was for a new water pump. One evening, as she brought Keitan a bowl of stew, he held up the turquoise hawk amulet that she had cleaned and returned to him. This was my father's, he said, his voice low. He was a great chief, a Nantan. His name was Taz Ayari. Ilara had never heard the name. What happened to him? Keitan's eyes seemed to look past her into a painful distance. He believed in the white man's peace. He met with a general from the Bluecoats under a flag of truce to sign a treaty that would give our people the sacred mountains forever. It was a lie. He paused the silence in the cellar, thick with ghosts. They murdered him and his warriors as they slept. They said he was a renegade who broke the truce, a lie to cover their dishonor. I was just a boy. I escaped into the hills with this. He closed his hand around the amulet. A cold dread washed over Ilara. This was more than just a case of mistaken identity. This man wasn't a simple raider. Why were you near Redemption's Bluff, Keitan? Why were you alone? He finally looked at her, and the full weight of his purpose was in his eyes. It was a gaze that held the destiny of a people. I was not wandering, he said, his voice resonating with a new power. I came here to find something they stole from my father the night they killed him. It is the heart of our people, the key to our future. Without it, We will scatter and die like dust in the wind." He leaned forward, his expression intense, his secret finally laid bare. "I am his son, and I am the last true heir of the Chiricahua Apache." The words hung in the air of the small cellar, heavier than the tons of earth above them. The last true heir of the Chiricahua Apache. Ilara stared at Keitan, seeing him for the first time, not as a patient or a fugitive, but as something far more significant and dangerous. The stories whispered around campfires, the fearful legends told by soldiers and settlers of a lost line of Apache leadership, a ghost prince who would one day return to unite the scattered bands. It was all real. And he was sitting 3 feet from her. "What did they steal?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It has a name in my tongue," he said. "Izzy-cloth. In your words, it is a medicine bundle, but it is more than that. It holds the history of my people, the wisdom of the chiefs before me, the sacred items that protect us and guide our path. My father, Taz Ayari, carried it to the peace talk as a symbol of our tribe's spirit. To possess it is to hold the authority of the Nantan. It is the proof of my claim, the one thing that can bring the last free families out of the mountains and forge them into a nation again. And you think it's here in Redemption's Bluff?" The idea seemed impossible, a sacred Apache relic, hidden in a dusty town, run by a man like Elias Thorne. "The general who betrayed my father was named Marcus Thorne." Keitan stated, his eyes like chips of obsidian. Ilara's blood ran cold. "Thorne related to the marshal?" His older brother, Keitan, confirmed. "Marcus Thorne was killed in a skirmish a few years after the betrayal, but stories among my people said he took the Izzy-cloth as a personal trophy, a prize of war. Elias Thorne came to this territory for 2 reasons: to build a name for himself and to find the inheritance his brother left behind. I believe that inheritance is my father's bundle. He does not know what it truly is. To him it is just a collection of savage curiosities, a piece of his brother's bloody legacy." Suddenly everything clicked into place. Thorne's obsessive hunt for Keitan wasn't just about a hanging. It was about silencing the one man who knew the true story, the one man with a claim to the very trophy. Thorne likely held. The fabricated raid on the Miller homestead was the perfect pretext to legally and publicly eliminate the last heir of Taz Ayari. "So when he captured you," Ilara began. "He did not know who I was," Keitan interrupted. "Not at first. I was weak, close to death. To him I was just another Apache. But I believe he has grown suspicious. My silence, my refusal to break. He senses I am more than I seem. He wants me dead before I can become a voice." A new, terrible resolve hardened within Ilara. This was no longer just about saving one innocent man. It was about correcting a historical injustice, about restoring the heart of a people. Her small act of defiance at the Gallows had unwittingly placed her at the very center of a decades-old struggle. "We have to find it," she said, her voice firm. Keitan looked at her, a deep gratitude in his eyes that went beyond words. "This is not your fight, Ilara Vance. You have done more than any person has a right to ask. Thorne will not just hang you. He will make an example of you." "He's already suspicious of me," she countered, a grim determination on her face. "My life here is over one way or another. My father lost his way because he stood by and did nothing when he saw injustice. I will not make the same mistake. Tell me what it looks like." He described the Izzy-cloth in detail. It was not a single object, but a collection wrapped in a pouch made from the hide of a sacred white buffalo calf. Inside were objects of power, a lightning-scorched stone, the talon of a great eagle, bags of pollen from the 4 sacred mountains, and at its center, the turquoise hawk amulet his father had worn a twin to the one Katan now possessed. Their mission became clear. It was a 2-front war. By day, Ilara moved through the town, a careful spy in plain sight. She listened at the general store, gathered gossip at the well, and treated the marshal's deputies for minor ailments, all the while probing for any clue about the marshal's habits or possessions. She learned that Thorn was obsessively private, that he lived in rooms above his office, and that no one but him ever went inside his personal quarters. By night in the cellar, she and Katan planned. He drew maps of the surrounding territory and the dirt floor, showing her escape routes, hidden water sources, and places of sanctuary in the mountains. He taught her words in his language, how to read the signs of the desert, how to move without a sound. A bond formed between them in that cramped, dark space, forged in shared secrets and a desperate purpose. She was no longer just his healer, she was his ally. And he was no longer just her patient, he was the keeper of a legend that she was now sworn to protect. They knew they couldn't act alone. They needed a diversion, an inside man, someone who could get them close to Thorn's office. Their thoughts turned to the one man in town who had the trust of the marshal, but had also shown a glimmer of conscience, Jedediah Smith, the blacksmith. A quiet, powerful man whose forge was the town's central hub of information. He owed Ilara for setting his son's broken leg last winter. He was their best and only hope. The decision was made. Ilara would approach him, appeal to his sense of decency, and pray that the greed-poisoning Redemption's Bluff hadn't yet rotted his heart. The air in Jedediah Smith's forge was a thick cocktail of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil was the heartbeat of Redemption's Bluff, a sound so constant it was part of the silence. Jedediah was a mountain of a man, with arms like tree limbs, and a gentle, sorrowful face hidden behind a bushy beard. He paused in his work as Ilara approached, wiping his brow with a soot-stained forearm. "Miss Vance," he greeted, his voice a low rumble. "Something I can do for you. More chain for that pump." His eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't quite read, curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "No, Jedediah. I need to talk to you. Somewhere private." She said, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced around the forge, then jerked his head towards the small, cluttered storeroom at the back. Inside, surrounded by barrels of nails and stacks of iron bars, the air was even hotter. Ilara didn't waste time. She trusted her instinct, the sense that this man was fundamentally decent. She told him everything. She didn't use Katan's real name, referring to him only as the man from the Gallows. She explained the frame-up Marshal Thorn's connection to the murder of the Apache chief and the stolen sacred object Thorn likely possessed. She watched Jedediah's face carefully as she spoke, looking for the telltale signs of shock, of outrage, of belief. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring at a horseshoe hanging on the wall, as if it held all the answers. "That's a heavy story, miss," he finally said, his voice heavy as the iron he worked. "Marshal Thorn, he's a hard man, but I never took him for a ghoul living off his brother's crimes." "He is," Ilara insisted, "and he'll kill that man and me to keep it quiet. We need to get into his office, into his private quarters. We need a diversion, something big enough to draw him and his deputies out for a while. You hear everything in this town, Jedediah. You know his routines. Can you help us?" Jedediah rubbed his bearded chin, his gaze distant. "He's got a poker game he rides to over at Miller's Crossing every third night. Likes to get away. Tonight's the night. but he always leaves a deputy watching his office." He sighed a deep, weary sound. "It's a fool's errand, Miss Vance. You're asking me to put my own neck in Thorn's noose." "I'm asking you to help see justice done," she pressed her voice urgent, "for a people who have never known it." He looked at her then, and she saw a profound conflict in his eyes. He seemed to shrink within himself, the powerful blacksmith, suddenly looking old and burdened. "All right," he said so quietly she almost missed it. "I'll help. There's a back window to his office. The lock is old. I can make you a tool to jimmy it. And I'll handle the deputy. I'll tell him one of my horses has thrown a shoe and I need a hand. That should buy you 20 minutes. No more." Relief washed over Ilara so intensely she felt lightheaded. "Thank you, Jedediah. You won't regret this." "I already do," he muttered, turning away to find the right piece of steel. That night, a sliver of moon hung in the sky, offering little light. Ilara and Kaitan, who was now strong enough to move with the swift silence of a predator, slipped through the back alleys. Kaitan wore an old duster, of her father's, the wide brim of a battered hat pulled low to hide his face. As they neared the marshal's office, they saw Jedediah approach the deputy on watch, a lanky man named Peterson. The blacksmith gestured wildly towards his forge, and after a moment of grumbling, Peterson shouldered his rifle and walked off with him. The diversion had begun. They moved quickly. The tool Jedediah had fashioned worked perfectly, and the old window lock gave way with a soft click. Kaitan slipped through the opening first, as silent as smoke, and helped Ilara inside. The marshal's office was neat, almost sterile. It smelled of gun oil and cheap cigars. A locked door led to his living quarters. Kaitan examined the lock. "Stronger," he whispered, "but old." He pulled a thin, sharpened piece of wire from his boot, a tool of his own, and went to work. While he picked the lock, Ilara frantically searched the office. She checked drawers, looked behind pictures, and ran her hands along the spines of the few books on his shelf. Nothing. Then her eyes fell on his desk. Underneath a stack of wanted posters was a large, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. It wasn't town business. It was Thorn's personal journal. Her eyes scanned the pages, her heart pounding. The script was tight and angry. She found an entry from a few weeks prior. October 12th. "The Apache dog I found is a strange one. Silent. Defiant. There is a look in his eye that reminds me of the paintings I saw of the great chiefs. Marcus always said they had the devil's pride. Could it be? Could one of Tazayari's whelps have survived? If he knows about the bundle, he must not live to speak of it. The hanging will be a fitting end." A cold chill went down her spine. Kaitan had been right. Just then, the lock on the door clicked open. They slipped into Thorn's private room. It was sparse, a bed, a wardrobe, and a large iron-strapped footlocker at the foot of the bed. It had to be there. Kaitan knelt beside it. The lock was thick, heavy-duty. "This will take time," he breathed. "We don't have time," Ilara whispered, peering out the window. "They'll be back any minute." Suddenly, the front door of the office slammed open. "Check the back." It was Marshal Thorn's voice, laced with cold fury. Panic seized Ilara. The diversion had failed. It was a trap. Jedediah had betrayed them. Heavy footsteps pounded towards the room. There was no escape. Kaitan stood up, no longer a fugitive, but a warrior. He pushed Ilara behind him, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. He held nothing but the small piece of wire in his hand, a useless weapon against the guns that were about to storm the room. The door flew open. Marshal Thorn stood there, a Colt peacemaker leveled at Kaitan's chest. Behind him stood the Deputy Peterson, and framed in the doorway, a look of profound, gut-wrenching shame on his face, was Jedediah the blacksmith. "Evening Shadow," Thorn said with a cruel, triumphant smile. "Or should I call you by your father's name? I knew if I squeezed this town hard enough, the rats would lead me right to you." His eyes flicked to Elara. "And you, Miss Vance, you'll get a front-row seat at the hanging this time, from the end of your own rope." The air in the small room was thick with the metallic scent of impending violence. Thorn's grin was a predatory slash in the lamplight, his pistol unwavering. Keitan stood perfectly still, a coiled spring of lethal energy, his body shielding Elara. He was weaponless, trapped, but his eyes burned with a defiance that seemed to infuriate the marshal. "It's over," Thorn sneered. "I have to thank you, really. I wasn't certain you were who I thought you were until you came looking for this." He kicked the iron-strapped footlocker. "My brother's little souvenir." "It is not a souvenir," Keitan said, his voice low and dangerous. "It is the soul of my people. Something a man like you can never understand." "Oh, I understand value," Thorn retorted. "And the value of a legend is in its ending. Jedediah." He barked, not taking his eyes off Keitan. "Cuff him." Jedediah Smith stood frozen in the doorway. His massive shoulders slumped his face, a mask of misery. "Marshal, she saved my boy's life." "And I own your life," Thorn roared, his composure cracking for a second. "That gambling debt you owe me from Tucson, I can call it in right now and see you and your boy out on the street. Or I can forget it. Your choice. Now cuff him." The blacksmith's betrayal was born not of greed, but of desperation. Elara saw the agony in his eyes as he took a hesitant step forward, iron cuffs dangling from his hand. This was the moment. They had only one chance, and it had to be now. Elara's mind raced her fear, sharpening into a cold, clinical focus. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloguing everything. The oil lamp on the bedside table, the heavy curtains, Thorn's self-satisfied posture. Her gaze fell on a small table next to the wardrobe. On it was a grooming kit, a shaving razor, a brush and a glass bottle of bay rum aftershave, highly flammable alcohol. "Now, Jedediah," Thorn commanded. As the blacksmith moved, Elara acted. "Keitan the lamp!" She screamed. It was all the signal he needed. In a blur of motion, Keitan kicked backwards, sweeping his leg out and knocking the small bedside table over. The glass oil lamp crashed to the wooden floor, shattering and spreading burning oil in a whoosh of flame. At the same instant, Elara lunged for the grooming table. She grabbed the bottle of bay rum and hurled it into the spreading fire. The alcohol ignited with an explosive thwomp, sending a wall of flame erupting towards the ceiling. The heavy curtains caught fire instantly. Chaos erupted. The Deputy Peterson yelped in surprise, stumbling back. Thorn momentarily blinded by the flash of light, and Heat flinched, his aim wavering for a critical second. It was the only opening Keitan needed. He didn't charge Thorn. He moved laterally like a phantom towards the blacksmith. Jedediah, stunned and caught between loyalties, was an easy target. Keitan slammed into him, not as an attack, but as a pivot. He grabbed the heavy iron cuffs from the blacksmith's hand, spun, and in a single fluid motion, swung the chain like a whip. The heavy iron links connected with the wrist of Thorn's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. Thorn cried out in pain, his Colt peacemaker clattering to the floor. "Get the bundle," Keitan yelled to Elara, while Keitan engaged the marshal, who was now fumbling for a backup pistol with his left hand. Elara scrambled towards the footlocker. It was still locked. Desperate, she looked around the burning room. Her eyes landed on the fire poker, leaning against a small hearth. She grabbed it, the iron already warm. Jamming the tip into the hasp of the lock, she put all her weight on it, using it as a lever. The wood splintered. The old metal screamed. With a final desperate heave, the lock burst. She threw open the lid. Inside, nestled amongst some of her brother's old army effects, was a large bundle, wrapped in what was unmistakably white buffalo hide. It felt strangely alive in her hands, humming with a latent energy. "Got it!" she shouted. The room was now an inferno. Smoke filled the air, choking and thick. The deputy, having recovered his wits, was raising his rifle. From the floor, Thorn, clutching his broken wrist, roared, "Shoot them! Shoot them both!" Jedediah Smith, his face a mess of soot and tears, finally made his choice. He let out a primal roar and charged not at Katan or Ilara, but at the deputy. He slammed his body into Peterson, sending them both crashing into the wall as the rifle discharged into the ceiling. "Go get out!" the blacksmith bellowed, wrestling with the deputy. "I'll hold them." There was no time to argue. Katan grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her towards the window. He kicked out the glass and the frame and pushed her through the opening into the back alley. He followed a second later, just as a bullet from Thorn's second gun splintered the wood where his head had been. They didn't look back. They ran Ilara, clutching the sacred Izzy cloth to her chest, the shouts and screams from the marshal's burning office fading behind them. They plunged into the darkness of the labyrinthine alleys, the glow of the fire lighting their way. They had the heart of the Chiricahua. But they had just declared open war on Elias Thorn, and the desert was a very large, very unforgiving place to hide. The fire alarm bell began to clang, a frantic, dissonant sound that cut through the night. Shouts echoed through the streets of Redemption's Bluff as the town awoke to the sight of flames leaping from the marshal's office. The fire which had been their salvation was now a beacon marking their escape. "This way," Katan commanded, his voice tight. "To the livery." They ran, hugging the shadows. Ilara's lungs burned, and the heavy medicine bundle felt like it was made of lead, but she clutched it like it was her own heart. In the chaos, no one noticed the two figures slipping into the livery stable. The smell of hay and horse was a strange comfort. Katan moved with silent efficiency, his warrior instincts taking over completely. He didn't waste time with their own horses, knowing Thorn would expect that. Instead, he chose two of the marshal's own mounts, a powerful grey stallion and a sturdy bay mare. They were the best in town, bred for speed and endurance. "He will expect us to ride east towards the border," Katan whispered as he saddled the horses with practiced speed. "We ride north, into the Dragon's Tooth canyons. It is hard country. He will think we are fools to try it." As they led the horses out the back of the stable, the moon broke through the clouds, bathing the landscape in an ethereal silver light. It was beautiful and treacherous. They mounted up, and with a shared look of grim resolve, spurred the horses into a gallop, leaving the burning, screaming town behind them. They rode hard for hours, the thunder of hoofbeats, a prayer against the coming dawn. Katan led them on a punishing course through arroyos and over rocky mesas, a path that would be invisible to all but the most skilled tracker. He was in his element now, the desert night his ally. The land that was a mortal enemy to settlers was a sanctuary to him. Just as the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky, they reached the entrance to the Dragon's Tooth. The name was apt. It was a jagged maze of red rock canyon spires and dead ends, a place where a man could get lost and die of thirst within a mile of water. They found a small hidden alcove, a rock overhang, that concealed them and their horses from the sky. They were exhausted, bruised, and coated in a layer of dust and soot. Ilara slid from the saddle, her body aching. Katan immediately took up a watch position, his eyes scanning their back trail. "He will come," he said. Thorn's pride, is a fire that will not be quenched by water, only by blood. Ilara opened the izzy cloth for the first time. The white buffalo hide was soft and ancient. Inside the objects were just as he had described the stone that seemed to hum with heat, the eagle talon, the pollen bags. And in the center, a turquoise hawk amulet, a perfect twin to his own. It was a tangible piece of history, of a faith that had survived betrayal and murder. Seeing it, feeling its weight, Ilara finally understood. This was not just a rescue, it was a restoration. The day passed in a tense, watchful silence. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, painting the canyons in hues of orange and purple, Keitan stiffened. "They are here," he whispered. Ilara looked, her heart seizing. Far below at the mouth of the canyon system, she saw a posse of riders, at least a dozen men, led by a figure she recognized even at this distance as Marshal Thorn, his arm in a crude sling. They were trapped. The canyons that had been their refuge were now their tomb. But Keitan was not afraid. A strange calm had settled over him. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out a feather, a single perfect hawk feather. He placed it carefully on a high rock, weighing it down with a small stone. It was a signal. "My people have been watching," he said to her, a faint smile on his lips. "I sent a rider from the reservation before I first came to this town. They have been waiting for a sign that I had found the izzy cloth." Before Ilara could process what he meant, a sound echoed through the canyons. It was not a gunshot or a human cry. It was a high, piercing call, the cry of a hawk, but it was answered by another, and then another, from different points, high up on the canyon walls. Thorn and his posse heard it too. They stopped their horses, skittish, the men looking around nervously. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. From the rocks above, figures emerged. They were like ghosts materializing from the stone itself. Apache warriors, their faces grim, armed with rifles and bows. They held the high ground, a dozen silent, deadly figures appearing, where there had been only rock moments before. Thorn's posse panicked. Some tried to turn and flee, others fired wildly into the rocks. The canyon erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, ricocheting bullets and war cries that seemed to come from the very throat of the mountains. Keitan stood and pointed directly at the marshal. "Elias Thorn!" His voice boomed, imbued with the authority of a chief. "Your brother's debt is due." Thorn, his face contorted with rage and hatred, raised his pistol and charged forward directly towards their position. He was a man possessed, seeking a final, suicidal confrontation. Keitan didn't wait. He launched himself down the rocky incline, meeting Thorn halfway on a narrow ledge. It was not a long fight. It was brutal and primal. Thorn, with his broken wrist, was no match for Keitan's speed and fury. The fight ended not with a bullet, but with the marshal's own knife. In the end, Elias Thorn fell from the ledge, his body tumbling into the shadows below, his evil finally silenced. Seeing their leader fall, the rest of the posse broke and fled, harried by the Apache warriors, until they were nothing but a cloud of dust in the distance. Silence returned to the canyon, broken only by the wind. Keitan, breathing heavily, climbed back up to Ilara. He was spattered with blood, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, then at the medicine bundle in her hands. An older warrior approached them, his face a roadmap of dignity and hardship. He looked at Keitan, then at the izzy cloth, and bowed his head. "Nantan," he said the word full of reverence. "Chief." Keitan took the bundle from Ilara's hands, his touch gentle. He held it up for his warriors to see, and a great shout of triumph and relief echoed through the dragon's tooth. He turned back to Ilara. The din of his people faded into the background. In his eyes, she saw a question and an offering. "This is my world, Ilara Vance," he said, "a world of hardship and freedom. Your world is back there." He gestured vaguely towards the distant plains. Ilara looked back in the direction of Redemption's Bluff. There was nothing for her there. An empty infirmary, a past filled with ghosts, and a future as a wanted woman. Then she looked at Kaitan, at the proud, resilient people, now looking to him for guidance. She looked at the sacred mountains rising in the distance, their peaks touching the heavens. She had come west seeking anonymity, a place to hide from the world. But in saving this man, she had found something else, entirely a purpose. A place where she didn't have to hide. "My father taught me to do no harm," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in years. "But he also taught me to go where I am needed. It seems my place is no longer back there." Kaitan's answering smile was like the sun breaking over the mountains. He offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation, her small healer's hand, enfolded in the strong grip of the warrior chief. Together they turned their backs on the scorched earth of Redemption's Bluff and began the long ride towards the sacred mountains, towards the dawn of a new legend. And so the story of Ilara Vance and Kaitan the Apache Heir doesn't end in the dust of a forgotten town, but begins in the majesty of the sacred mountains. It's a testament to the fact that history is rarely as simple as the stories tell us. It's a tapestry woven with courage, betrayal, and the unbreakable spirit of those who fight for their legacy. Ilara the healer didn't just save a man's life, she helped restore the heart of a nation. And Kaitan, the last heir, proved that a leader's strength isn't just in fighting but in remembering. What do you think of Ilara's incredible choice? Was she a traitor or a true hero? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. These are the kinds of hidden histories we love to uncover, the stories that prove the Wild West was so much more than just cowboys and outlaws. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a great historical drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Thanks for listening.